Water turns to blood. Plague 1. It starts with something everyone thought they understood. Water. Simple, familiar, life-giving. But in a single moment, it changes. The Nile River, the heartbeat of Egypt, stops behaving like a river should. Clear water becomes something thick, heavy, unnatural. Life inside it begins to vanish. And suddenly, what was always there is no longer safe to trust. Now pause there, because this is not just an environmental disruption. It's a direct hit to dependence. Egypt doesn't function without the Nile. Everything flows from it. Food, trade, stability, identity. So when the river changes, everything downstream feels it immediately. Now imagine being there. You wake up like every other day, same routine, same direction, but when you reach the river, something is wrong. The source of life is no longer giving life, and that creates a kind of silence in the mind, because your system of understanding breaks for a moment. What is happening? Is this temporary? Can this be fixed? But it doesn't respond. It holds. And that is where your discomfort begins to rise. Because humans are built to trust patterns. The sun rises, the river flows, life continues. But when a pattern breaks without explanation, certainty begins to collapse. And this is where the deeper layer comes in. Because in Egypt's worldview, the Nile wasn't just water, it was tied to order, stability, the rhythm of life itself. So when it turns into something unrecognizable, it's not just physical disruption, it is meaning being challenged. The thing that gave structure to survival is no longer reliable, and that forces a question no one wants to ask. If the source I depend on can change without warning, what else can? Because once the foundation feels unstable, everything built on it starts to feel uncertain too. That's the weight of the first strike on Egypt. Not destruction everywhere, but the removal of trust in what was assumed to be permanent. And this is how it begins. Not with chaos, but with a system being confronted at its most basic level, its source. Frogs everywhere. Plague 2. It doesn't stop. In fact, it spreads. What was once contained begins to move beyond its limit. From the Nile River, something rises. Not destruction at first, overflow. Frogs, but not in balance, not in rhythm, not in measure, in invasion. They appear everywhere. Homes, beds, kitchens, storage rooms, places that were meant to feel safe no longer feel sealed. And that's what makes it disturbing, because nothing is technically attacking you, but nothing is leaving you alone either. Now imagine the experience. You open a door, you see a frog, you step forward, you see another frog, you try to create space, and then all frogs are jumping here and there. It's as if boundaries no longer mean anything. And when boundaries collapse, life stops feeling structured. It starts feeling crowded, uncontained, unmanageable. Because this is not just about frogs, it's about control breaking down in a way that feels personal. Not violent, not destructive, just overwhelming. And that kind of pressure is different because you can't fight it directly. You can only endure it. Now zoom out. In ancient Egypt, order wasn't just practical, it was sacred. Everything had its place, its limits, its function. So when something begins to multiply beyond its place, it feels like order itself is sleeping. Not just inconvenience, system failure. Because when what is meant to stay where it should be starts showing up everywhere, normal stops being reliable. And once normal is unreliable, peace becomes harder to keep. Now bring it closer, because this is where it hits emotionally. When life feels overcrowded, too many problems, too many pressures, too many interruptions, Your mind starts losing its rhythm. You can't think clearly anymore. You can't rest properly. Everything feels like it's spilling into everything else. And that feeling is not just physical, it's mental, it's even emotional. Because overwhelm doesn't just fill up space, it erodes stability. And that's the real weight of this plague, not harm, but saturation. A life that no longer feels like it has edges. And once that happens, you start realizing how much you're dependent on structure without ever realizing it. Because you don't usually think about order until it disappears. And that is what this moment reveals. Not destruction of life, but disruption of boundaries. And when boundaries break, everything starts to feel like too much. Dust becomes lies. Plague 3. Now the pressure changes shape. It's no longer just around you, it's on you. The ground itself begins to turn against comfort. From dust, something rises. Small, unseen at first, then impossible to ignore. Lies. Not arriving from a distance, not carried in from somewhere else. They come from the earth beneath their feet. The Nile River has already struck. Now the ground responds. And suddenly, even what was stable beneath you is no longer neutral. Now imagine the experience. There is no clean space anymore. No place that feels untouched. You sit down, they are still there. You stand up, they are still there. You try to escape, they are still with you. And that's the problem. Because the first two plagues were external. This one is personal. It crosses from environment into experience. Now pause, because this is where discomfort becomes intimate. You can manage distance when something is outside you, but when it becomes attached to you, you can't negotiate it anymore. You can only endure it. And that changes everything. Now zoom out. In the world they knew, the ground wasn't just soil, it was stability, some sort of foundation, something you trust without thinking. So when the dust itself becomes a source of disturbance, it feels like the foundation is no longer neutral. It is active, unstable, and that creates a deeper kind of tension. Because now there is no safe surface to stand on. Everything feels compromised. And when you lose confidence in what you stand on, even standing becomes stressful. Now bring it closer again, because this is where it turns inward. This plague doesn't just affect surroundings, it affects presence. You can't separate yourself from it. You can't distance yourself from it. It follows you into every moment. And that creates a quiet realization. Some pressures in life don't stay external, they move into your awareness. They interrupt rest, they interrupt focus, they interrupt peace. Not loudly, but constantly. And that kind of pressure is different because it doesn't end when you change location. It ends only when the condition itself changes. Now step back, because this pattern is becoming clear. The first was water, what they depended on. Then the frogs that invaded their space. Now what reaches their own body, dust becoming lies. It's moving closer, and with each step, control becomes less theoretical and more personal. And that is where the story continues, because the next strike doesn't just surround life, it attacks what was once considered untouchable. 4. Swarm of flies. Plague 4. Now the air changes. Not the ground, not the water, the space between things. What you breathe, what you move through, what surrounds every moment. It becomes occupied. Flies. But not in passing, not in small numbers, not something you can ignore by waving it away once or twice. This time, it doesn't leave. It fills the atmosphere like a constant interruption, and suddenly there is no silence anymore. Even stillness has noise inside it. Now imagine living in it. You can't sit in peace. You can't focus in quiet. You can't even rest without interruption. Everything you try to do is followed not by danger, but by disturbance. And that's what makes it different. Because some things don't need to destroy you to feel overwhelming. They only need to remove your ability to experience peace. Now pause, because this is where pressure becomes psychological. The first plagues attacked resources. The second invaded space. The third became personal. This one enters the atmosphere, the unseen layer of life. And when the atmosphere is compromised, everything inside it feels heavy. Now zoom out. In the ancient world of Egypt, air wasn't just empty space. It represented life, breath, continuity. So when that space becomes filled with constant disruption, it feels like life itself has lost clarity. Not because everything is destroyed, but because nothing is clear anymore. There is no moment where things settle, no moment where the mind can reset, just continuous interruption. And that kind of pressure is subtle but exhausting, because you don't always notice what peace feels like until it's no longer available. Now bring it closer, because this is where internal tension starts forming. When everything around you keeps interrupting your ability to think, to focus, or to rest, your mind begins to shift. You stop expecting calm, you start anticipating disturbance, and slowly that becomes normal. But it's not normal, it's erosion. Because peace is not just the absence of chaos, it is the presence of stillness. And when stillness is removed, your internal world starts to feel unstable too. Now step back, because a pattern is forming again. Each strike is moving closer. Water affected the environment. Frogs invaded their space. Lice on their bodies. Flies in the atmosphere. Everything is tightening. Everything is closing in. And nothing is staying at a safe distance anymore. And that is the point. Because pressure, when it escalates like this, forces attention. Not just to what is happening, but to what it means. And what comes next is where the distinction begins between disruption and direct confrontation. Because now, the system itself starts to respond. Livestock diseased, plague 5. Now it gets heavier, because this time it's not just discomfort anymore. It is loss, but not sudden, dramatic loss at first. It begins quietly inside the systems they depend on. Animals begin to fail, livestock collapses, strength turns into weakness, productivity into decay, wealth begins to disappear without warning. And in a world like Egypt, this is not just agriculture, this is survival, this is economy, this is identity tied to provision. Because what you own is not just possession, it is security. And when that starts breaking down, certainty starts breaking with it. Now pause, because this is no longer about environment, it is about structure. The Nile River had already been struck. The land had already become unstable. The atmosphere already uncomfortable. Now the systems that produce stability begin to fail. And that changes everything, because systems are what people trust when emotions are unstable. You'll be fine. There's supply. There's backup. But when systems collapse, there's nothing left to lean on. Now imagine the experience. You look at what once represented wealth, and it is no longer functioning. Not destroyed in a moment, but failing in layers. And that kind of loss is different, because it doesn't just remove what you have, it removes what you expect will continue. And expectations collapsing is its own kind of shock. Now zoom out. In ancient thinking, livestock was not just property, it represented continuation, generational stability, the idea that tomorrow is secured by what exists today. So when livestock begin to die, it feels like the future is becoming uncertain, not just the present. And that's the deeper weight of this plague. It is not just taking resources, it is destabilizing tomorrow. Now bring it closer, because this is where the fear begins to shift. When what you rely on for continuity starts breaking, your mind begins to adjust. You start thinking differently, more cautiously, more anxiously, less confidently about what comes next, because stability is no longer assumed, it must be questioned. And once you start questioning stability, peace becomes harder to access. Now step back, because the progression is clear now. What started as a disruption has become systemic failure. The water, space, body, atmosphere, economy, each layer is being touched, and each one is removing another layer of confidence in the world as it is known. And that raises the deeper question underneath all of it. If everything external can be shaken, what actually remains unshaken? Because that's where the story is heading next, into something more direct, more personal, and harder to ignore. Plague 6 boils on the body. Now the shift becomes undeniable, because this time it's not around them anymore, it's on them. Ashes, heat, pain rises from within the skin itself, boils, not distant, not environmental, not external, personal, personal and immediate. The body becomes the battlefield. Now imagine the moment there is no space left to stand back and observe, no distance to create separation. What you feel, you carry with you everywhere you go. And that changes everything, because when suffering moves into the body, it removes the last illusion of control. You can manage what's outside you, you can adapt to what surrounds you, but when your own body becomes the source of distress, there is nowhere else to go. Now pause, because this is the turning point in the pattern. The Nile River was struck first, then the environment, then the ground, then the air, then the systems of wealth, and now the self, the final layer of personal stability. Now zoom out, because in ancient understanding, the body was not just physical, it represented dignity, strength, identity, control over one's own experience. So when the body itself became affected, it was not just discomfort, it was vulnerability exposed, because there is no longer any layer left that is untouched. And that creates a different kind of awareness, not confusion anymore, but exposure. Now bring it closer, because this is where everything becomes internal. You are no longer dealing with what is happening around you, you are dealing with what is happening in you. And that shifts the emotional weight completely, because pain that exists externally can sometimes be explained away, but pain that exists within you forces attention constantly, and there is no escape from it. Now step back, because the progression is no longer subtle. Each plague has been moving inward: water, environment, the body of the land, atmospheres, the systems, and then the body itself. Everything is tightening, everything is closing distance until there is nothing left to externalize the experience. And that is a deeper tension forming now, because once everything external is removed, you are left with only interpretation. What does this mean? What is happening? What remains when everything familiar is gone? And that question leads into the next stage, where even explanation itself starts to break down. Because now, silence is no longer external, it becomes internal too. Plague 7, hail from the sky. Now the direction changes again, because what's been happening from below and around now comes from above. The sky itself becomes active, not rain, not weather, something heavier: hail. But this is not ordinary impact from nature behaving normally. It is destruction falling from the atmosphere in a coordinated way. And for the first time in the sequence, escape becomes almost impossible, because when pressure comes from above, there is no direction left to run. Now imagine it unfolding: people rushing for cover, animals left exposed, fields collapsing under impact. Everything becomes dangerous in a way that feels final. And suddenly, what was once open space becomes a threat. Now pause, because this is where the pattern becomes impossible to ignore. The Nile River has already been struck, the water has been changed, then life multiplied uncontrollably. The ground turned unstable, the air became disturbed, then systems of wealth collapsed, then the body itself was affected, and now the sky responds. This is no longer layered disruption, it is total coverage. Now zoom out, because the sky represents order from above, stability beyond human reach, something consistent, predictable. So when the sky itself begins to produce destruction, it feels like even the highest level of stability is no longer safe. Nothing remains untouched. Now bring it closer, because this is where the emotional weight deepens. When everything below you has already failed, you begin to look up for relief, for escape, for perspective. But when pressure comes from above too, even hope feels pressured, because there is no direction left that is safe. Now step back, because the progression is tightening again. Each stage removes another layer of distance. At this point, it is no longer just damage. It is about total disruption of normal existence, because nothing is stable anymore. Not below you, not around you, not within you, not above you. And when every direction is affected, you are forced into one place: stillness, but not peace. Pressure filled stillness. And that sets the stage for what is coming next. Because after external systems fail, the question moves inward again. Not what is happening outside, but what remains when everything familiar has already been shaken. Plague 8: Locust Invasion. Now the sky clears, but the damage begins to multiply, because what survived the hail is no longer safe for long. Something is coming in to finish what was left behind. Locust. Not a few, not a scattered movement, a living wave. And it moves with precision that feels almost unnatural. What the storm did not destroy, this consumes. Now imagine watching it unfold. Fields that were once full becoming empty in moments. Green turning into nothing. Food sources disappearing in real time. Not over weeks, not over time, but as if time itself is being erased from the land. And there is no negotiation with it, no resistance that lasts. Now pause, because this is where the pattern shifts again. The Nile River had already been struck, water had turned into blood, life had multiplied uncontrollably. Now zoom out. In ancient Egypt, agriculture was not just food production, it was survival over time, future security. Because what is stored is what carries you forward. So when locusts arrive and consume everything that survived, it's not just loss, it is the removal of continuity. The future is no longer being protected, it is being eaten. Now bring it closer, because this is where psychological pressure deepens. When what you rely on for tomorrow disappears, your mind begins to adjust in real time. You stop thinking long term, you begin to think survival to survival, moment to moment. And that shift is powerful, because hope is often tied to continuity. But when continuity breaks, hope feels unstable. Now step back, because the progression is now complete in a new way. This is not just escalation anymore, it is depletion. Everything that could be built on is being stripped layer by layer. The water, the environment, the body, atmosphere, systems, the sky, and now future provision. Nothing is left untouched in its ability to sustain life. And that leads into the next stage, because after consumption comes darkness, the removal of visibility itself. And when you can no longer see what is happening, understanding begins to break down completely. Plague 9: Darkness over Egypt. Now everything changes shape again, but this time nothing moves. No invasion, no destruction falling, no consumption happening in front of the eyes, just absence. Darkness. A darkness so deep it feels physical. Not the kind you adjust to, the kind that removes the reference point, and suddenly even simple things become uncertain. Where you are, what time it is, what direction anything lies in, everything becomes unfamiliar. Now imagine it, a nation that was once structured, active, and loud, now unable to see itself properly. Movement slows, life pauses, normal rhythm disappears, and in the silence, fear grows differently. Because when you can't see what is around you, your imagination begins to fill in the gap. Now zoom out. In ancient understanding, darkness is not just absence of light. It represents confusion, loss of direction, a world without clarity. Because light is what allows structure to be seen. And when structure cannot be seen, everything else feels uncertain. Now bring it closer, because this is where internal pressure intensifies. When you cannot see what is happening around you, your mind begins to project possibilities, worst case scenarios, unanswered assumptions, and slowly, uncertainty becomes heavier than the actual situation, because the unknown is often more stressful than the known. Now step back. Each plague has removed another layer of stability. Control over water, control over environment, control over the body, control over the atmosphere, control over the systems, over the sky, over self, over provision, and now control over visibility itself. Everything external has been disrupted. Everything internal has been pressured. And now even perception is affected. Because when you cannot see clearly, you cannot interpret clearly as well. And that leads to the final stage, where loss is no longer environmental, it becomes personal, immediate, irreversible in feeling. Because what comes next is the breaking of what was once considered untouchable. Plague 10, the firstborn, the breaking point. Now the silence feels different. It is no longer confusion, it is anticipation. Because after everything that has already happened, there is a sense that the story is reaching its final edge. And then it comes, not slowly, not symbolically, directly. The final strike, the firstborn. Now pause here, because this is where the weight of everything converges. The Nile River has been struck, the water had turned into blood, life had become something else, the ground become unstable, the air was disturbed, the systems of wealth collapsed, the body was afflicted, the sky had released destruction, provision was stripped away, darkness had covered everything, and now it reaches what was once considered untouchable: family, legacy, the future. Now imagine the moment, not noise, not chaos in the street, but a sudden realization passing through every household at the same time. Something irreversible has happened. And in that instant, certainty breaks completely. Because this is not about convenience anymore. It's about the loss of control that cannot be replaced. Now zoom out. Because in ancient Egypt, the firstborn represented continuation, identity carried forward, the future of households, the strength of families, the stability of generations. So when this is struck, it is not just emotional, it is structural collapse at the deepest human level, because everything else can be rebuilt, but some losses redefine what rebuilding even means. Now bring it closer, because this is where everything becomes personal at a national scale. There is no system left to trust, no environment left to rely on, no stability left to interpret as normal. Everything that once gave structure to life has now been shaken. And what remains in silence? Heavy silence. The kind that doesn't explain itself. It only forces reflection. Now step back, because this is the completion of the pattern. Not just escalation, but total removal of assumed control. The water, the environment, life, the ground, the atmosphere, the systems, the body, the sky, provision, light, and legacy. Everything that built confidence in the world as it was known has been addressed, and what's left is a question no one can avoid. What do you rely on when everything you relied on has been shaken? Because that is where the story ultimately leads, not through judgment, but through realization. And from here, the narration is no longer about what was lost. It becomes about what comes after everything is stripped away.